Immediately after World War II, new tension arose between communist and democratic countries. The tension manifests itself in the post-war settlement of Eastern Europe, and then erupted into war on the Korean Peninsula. A potential World War III occurred when nuclear missiles replaced Cuba by the Soviet Union. Today, we'll explore the episodes that make up the first half of the Cold War and the history of Western civilization. The Cold War is kind of defined as a clash between the Soviet Union and its allies, Eastern countries, and the United States and its allies, the Western countries. And it lasts between 1947, when the term was coined, to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There was an economic aspect to the Cold War. That is, the United States was a capitalist country and believed in free trade and private property, and the Soviet Union was a communist country that believed in a control economy directed by the government with no personal freedoms. There's also a political element, as the United States was a democracy and allowed for voting and, again, personal freedoms. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state ruled by the elite members of the Communist Party. It's a Cold War because there was no direct conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, at least officially, but it's fought in proxy wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan, and so forth. Now, if we look at the situation right after World War II, before the Cold War started, Europe again was on the decline, and it was kind of divvied up by these two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union had just defeated Germany. It had soldiers and armies in all of Eastern Europe, and it didn't remove those armies and allow for free elections. So Winston Churchill, political leader in Great Britain, mentioned that an iron curtain was falling down, dividing East and West. And that is, the Western countries were becoming communist under the influence of the Soviet Union, kind of like satellite states. And there was this kind of wall, at least figuratively now, but later, actually, there will be a wall dividing those communist countries from the democratic countries in the West. Of course, this is heightened with the atomic bomb. The bomb dropped in Japan might be the first actually event of the Cold War. Is more a warning to the Soviet Union than it was to decimate Japan. And then the Soviet Union gets its own atomic bombs, so therefore there's a heightened tension because you have these weapons that can eliminate humanity. So how does the West respond? Well, it believes, according to one theorist, George Kennan, who wrote about this, in containment, that you should have a long, patient response to the Soviet Union. That is, don't try to attack them directly, but keep them in one area and don't let it spread anywhere. So keep this idea of containment with you as we discuss the Cold War. Then there was the Truman Doctrine. This is the belief that we should aid countries that are fighting communists. So there's wars in Greece, for example, in Turkey, and there's kind of government versus communist force. And the United States is going to give money to these individuals, millions of dollars, to help fight the communists. Then there's the Marshall Plan. This is the giving of money to countries, so therefore their economy doesn't fall apart and they can be rebuilt. So the Secretary of State, George Marshall, arranges for $13 billion to be spread through these countries, particularly in Western Europe. The Eastern countries did not take it, to rebuild their economy and therefore keep the communists in those countries from getting hold of the country. And lastly, there's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a defensive treaty. If anybody's attacked in NATO, all the other countries will come to its aid. And so therefore, it's going to be a deterrent for the Soviet Union and any of its allies to attack any NATO country. The Soviets responded. One thing, Berlin was surrounded by Eastern Germany, and they wanted to cut it off, and they blockaded it. But the Americans and other individuals kind of air transport in supplies to Berlin. This is called the Berlin Airlift here, where they're actually going to supply 13,000 tons of food and medicine in a 10 months period just to keep Berlin safe and not for it to fall to the communists. There's the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is a far more destructive atomic bomb. So again, this and the Soviet Union produces larger and larger atomic bombs using new methods that again frighten people in the West. And then you have the Warsaw Pact. This is a very direct response to NATO. This is the countries in Eastern Europe which are going to be in a military alliance with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is the major communist country, but then you have another big communist country, China. They were locked in a civil war before World War II between the nationalists under Chiang Kai shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. Now, eventually, the nationalists kind of lose ground, and the communists become more and more powerful. Immediately after World War II, the Japanese are defeated, and China erupts into a civil war from 1945 to 1949. And the communists win. The nationalists escape to Taiwan, and they create their own country there. Now, Mao initiates a couple of reforms. A great leap forward is a program to create the agricultural, I guess, production, and he does this in a horrible, horrible means. And what ends up happening is that the actual agricultural production just plummets, and millions of people die as a result of this starvation. Afterwards, there's questions about his leadership, and he initiates a cultural revolution, which is a kind of idealistic and political revolution, especially with the young people called the Red Guard. And they kind of make Mao into almost a supernatural entity. They worship him, and they destroy all the middle class people. They destroy a lot of historical objects, and it's a very sad time in terms of history and intellectual thought. That everybody was targeted who kind of stood for something that was, historical or intellectual, and it was a lot of destruction. Eventually, it's kind of curtailed, and Mao is pushed to the side. And after he dies, the new leaders, Deng Xiaoping and others, make China a more moderate country and open it up to the world. But now we have a very ardent, very ideological communist country in China at this point, which leads to the Korean War. Now, after World War II, Korea was kind of divided between the communist and the Western American powers. And in the North, the communists put a leader who is sympathetic to their causes in um, Kim Il Sung, and in the South, there's a kind of a little bit of a puppet state created by the Americans. And Kim Il Sung gets support from the communists to attack the South and unify the country. So he launches attack in June 1950 with 80,000 troops, and the United Nations authorizes the defense of the South. At first, the North wins, and they've almost conquered all of the territory, and it's only the very southeast corner that is held by the South Koreans. The UN arrives and launches lots of counterattacks, mainly American soldiers, and then they're very successful, and they push the northern Koreans all the way to the Chinese border. The Chinese end up using volunteers, hundreds of thousands of volunteers from China, quote unquote volunteers, join, and they push back the UN forces. And there's a truth along the 98th parallel, pretty much right where the war began. So you have a very brutal war with, especially for the Korean Peninsula, but what you're going to see is a return to the status quo, a communist North and a Western-backed South. During the Korean War, there was a lot of anxiety about communists in America, and you have the Second Red Scare. You have the House Un-American activities, which started fighting the Nazis, but after World War II, they targeted the communists. There's a very important investigation of Hollywood, where they looked at producers and directors who might be sympathetic to communists. There was also the discovery of real spies. You had the British American spy ring with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were passing on secrets to the Soviet Union about the atomic bomb. And then you have a Senator Joseph McCarthy, who puts this panic into overdrive. He lists names of people that are sympathetic to communists in the State Department and later the military. Everybody's paranoid. If you're on the list, you're blacklisted, basically. And everybody will be suspicious of you. And he really held the country in his palm of his hand as everybody was paranoid to question him. But eventually censured by the Senate, and his attack, particularly in the army, falls short as people realize that he was more like a bully than having a lot of accurate um, evidence about the existence of communists throughout the U.S. government and military. But it is a definitely an interesting episode in U.S. history, and one where fear was able to grip the country. After Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev comes to power in the Soviet Union, and he starts a process of de-Stalinization. Stalin killed millions of people, and so forth. And Khrushchev gives a secret speech saying that Stalin perhaps went too far. And he initiates this idea of peaceful coexistence. He visits the United States, and things look like they might be on a better path. But then some problems arise. In Eastern Europe, there's a revolt in Hungary against the communists and it's crushed brutally. And that obviously was a sad episode for those that supported freedom. And then in 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, basically setting up a barrier between East and West Berlin. And that becomes a symbol of the division of the Cold War. The most tense period is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it starts with Fidel Castro and his revolution. So he seizes control of Cuba, initiates a socialist revolution, seizes a lot of American property as a result, and that obviously is going to elicit some sort of response. The United States decides to embargo Cuba, which means that we will no longer trade and cut off our diplomatic relations with Cuba. And then in April 1961, Kennedy initiates the Bay of Pigs invasion, where about 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans are sent back to Cuba, and it's a complete failure. So Castro thinks that Kennedy is weak. He thinks that perhaps the Americans might evade again, and the best way to deter an invasion is to have nuclear missiles. Because if you remember, Florida is only about 90 miles away from Cuba, and if you have a nuclear missile there, you could blow up the city very quickly. It'd be a bad idea to invade Cuba ever again. So they start setting up nuclear missiles, which they get from the Soviet Union. Kennedy faces a very tense moment. If he attacks, perhaps there'll be a nuclear assault and you could have World War III. So what he does instead is to quarantine or to blockade Cuba. That means he sends up Navy ships all around Cuba. And it's really the brink of war because there are Soviet ships headed towards Cuba. But the Soviet Union eventually backs off. It agrees to remove the missiles if the United States also removes some missiles from Turkey. And it also agrees for better relations. And this idea that we shouldn't get so close to World War III where we're launching nuclear missiles at each other because that would be a huge problem. So, was this inevitable? Communism